Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Gabrielle Principe. She is professor of psychology at the College of Charleston. She has a lifelong fascination with the implications of evolutionary ideas on cognitive development and a serious interest in translating the latest scientific research about human development into information that parents and teachers can use to better rear and educate children. She is the author of Your Brain on Childhood, The Unexpected Side Effects of Classrooms, Ballparks, Family Rooms, and the Minivan. So, Dr. Principe, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you, Ricardo. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So, today we're going to focus a lot on memory and the
Mhm.
development of memory because you study that. So, is there, do we know when children start forming memories? Or, because when we think about memory, we usually think about things that people remember explicitly, right? But there's
Right,
also implicit memory. So, how should we think about that?
right. So that's a difficult question. When does memory start? And it depends on exactly what you're suggesting. It depends on the type of memory, right? So there's some really cool research that demonstrates that we can form memories even before birth. But they're more on the implicit side of things. And let me just talk about one because I think this research is really super cool. So there's some work that had been done. It's probably about 30 or so years old, where a researcher had pregnant mothers in the last 6 weeks of pregnancy read Dr. Seuss's A Cat in the Hat out loud um, for those 6 weeks. And what he and his colleagues learned, is that after birth, a couple of days after birth, newborns preferred hearing their mothers read Cat in the Hat aloud, relative to her reading other sorts of things. So they sort of, understood and recognized and remembered to some extent what that felt like and what that sounded like. And not only did they prefer to hear their mothers read Cat in the Hat over something else, they even preferred to hear strangers read A Cat in the Hat relative to something else. So there's some sort of memory there, but that's sort of more implicit. It's more, recognition. It demonstrates a learned preference, but it's not, a full-blown memory of experience or anything like that. And there's all kinds of demonstrations of memory in infancy, too. There's some cool research that shows that if you take an infant and, for instance, tie like a ribbon to her foot and tie that ribbon to a mobile that hangs over a crib, she can learn that contingency, that if she kicks her foot, it will make the mobile move. Now, if you bring that infant back in the lab a couple of days later, infants can retain that. So by the time they're about 2 months old, they will, up until a day or two later, move their leg when they're in that same crib and seeing that same mobile, even though their leg is no longer attached to that mobile. So they sort of remember what they've learned before. And as infants get older, the extent to which they can remember it gets longer. So by 3 months old, infants can remember that relationship for about a week. When they're 6 months old, they can remember it for about 2 weeks. And so memory sort of proceeds along that way. So things get a little more complicated maybe during the second half of the first year of life. So kids then can begin to do things like delayed imitation. So delayed imitation is what it sounds like. It's just imitating behavior, not immediately, but after a delay. And if you're able to do that, that demonstrates some sort of memory because you're reproducing a behavior, that you've seen in the past, right? So researchers have done fun things like bring kids into a lab and do weird behaviors in front of them. One of the most famous studies is an infant comes into a lab and watches an experimenter like put his head down on the table and turn on a light with his head, right? And if you bring a 6-month-old into the lab, they can reproduce that behavior on a different day. So you see those sorts of memories happen, but it's really not until we're about 2.5 or so that we have the kind of explicit verbal memories of experience, that I think we typically think about when we think about memory.
So, I mean, is it in any way correct to say that as we develop as children, we acquire new types of memory, or at least some aspects of memory come online over time?
Yeah, so the kind of memory that you think about when you think about memory, like memory of experience, that is a really late developing, I don't know, flavor of memory that doesn't happen, until we're older, until, toddlerhood, the preschool years. And the way that that comes online, to some extent it has to do with neurological development, but to a large extent it has to do with all sorts of other things. So if you think about memory for experience, it's a type of what's known as episodic memory, or more specifically, autobiographical memory, which is what it sounds like. It's memory for like life's important salient episodes. So to have an episodic memory, there's sort of two things. You have a memory of kind of the WH things, the where, when, who, when it happened. It's tied to a specific time, specific people, at a specific place. And you also have something called autonoetic consciousness, which is sort of you're aware that you experienced something, so you can go back in time and have that feeling of re-experiencing, right? So that doesn't happen until later on. It's late developing, and it has to do, you need language to have that, because you have to put life's experiences sort of in a narrative to do that, and we can talk more about that. You have to have a sense of self for a memory to be truly yours. You have to have an idea, that you're a being separate from the rest of the world, and you also have to be taught sort of the conventional narrative way of making sense of experiences, that they're in a temporal order, and the sorts of things you're supposed to put in there. So yeah.
And how good are us at recalling our memories? Because there's that idea in popular science that we are really bad at recalling at least the details surrounding a particular event, for example. And I've heard people saying that it's every time we recall a memory, we rewrite it. So is that right?
Yeah, that is right. So memory isn't like a library or a storage device like your phone. So when you experience something, it's not the case that you build a representation of experience that's always there, and that every time you think about it or bring it to consciousness, it's the same thing, right? So what you're saying is right on. The idea is that each time you remember an event, bring it to consciousness, you're rewriting it, or reconstructing it is the right way to think about it. So most memory researchers talk about memory as being constructive or reconstructive, and it's the idea that we literally are rebuilding our memories each time we bring them to consciousness, and we're putting all sorts of new things in there. We've had new experiences over time, new feelings, we might be in a bad mood, all those sorts of things get kind of meshed in there when we recollect things. We don't necessarily feel it. It's not the case that you feel like, oh, I'm remembering something I remembered last week, but now there's a little error in it. There's a little tweak in it. It's not a conscious sort of thing, but it just, it happens. So because memory is reconstructive like that, the other thing that you said is true, is that memories can be horrible, notoriously bad. They're fluid, they're flexible, they're dynamic. I think, and lots of researchers think they're that way for a reason. And we can certainly talk about that. But yeah, memory can be horrible, but it can also be, amazingly good and detailed. And it depends on, so many different things. So memory, can be very, very good. It can be very, very bad. So it can be all of those things. And it's because of the constructive nature of remembering.
Right. And
Yeah.
I mean, people talk a lot about memories among themselves. I mean, when people share memories, when they have conversations that revolve around memory sharing, do these conversations also contribute to those sorts of phenomena that we're just talking about? Like, I mean, do they lead to errors in terms of how people recall their memories and things like that?
So when you're talking about memories with other people, that certainly can be a place where errors happen, because usually what you're doing is, especially if you're talking about an event that you shared. So if you're with your family and you're all talking about an event where you're all together, different folks might have different ideas about what happened. Different people remember different details, and as different people are contributing different pieces of what's happening, you're constructing this collective version, this collective idea, what happened. Now, if everybody's memories are accurate, you're going to end up with a bigger, better, fuller sense of what happened. But if there's individuals in there who have false ideas about what really happened, if their memories are wrong or have somehow been changed, they might introduce new ideas into a conversation, and those new ideas can become part of your memory. So one of the things we study in my lab is just that. I'm very interested in how conversations in really young humans, so how conversations among preschoolers with each other and with their mothers can influence memory. And we've just found, that the answer is greatly, and that in terms of can that be a context for false memories, we found that absolutely, that if friends or mothers have false beliefs about what happened, that conversational context can be a place that engenders false memories of experience.
Mm-hmm. And are there individual differences in terms of how people share their memories? Are there different memory sharing styles?
Yeah, I think the place where that research, I don't know, I think is most salient is with the sorts of conversations that mothers and young children have about the past. So there's this idea that the way that we learn to build our representations of experience, like how to make sense of experiences, we're experiencing things, and then also how to relay those representations to other people. So how we learn how to talk about our experiences, and the regular narrative way that we do is through conversations with mothers. Because if you look at how really young kids remember experience, they're not saying that much. They're contributing a word here and there, and it's usually mothers, caregivers who are structuring this narrative, and kids are putting a little bit in here and there and there. And over time, as kids become better rememberers and better retellers of experience, parents sort of can let go of that scaffolding, and children contribute more and more and more. And so to your question about styles, that's where styles really come into play. There's probably 30 years of research that demonstrates that mothers and dads, caregivers, tend to vary along this continuum of what's called elaborativeness. So really elaborative mothers tend to provide a lot of extra detail. They confirm children's contributions. They follow the child's lead in conversational remembering, and that's usually good. So when mothers take on that sort of style, you have kids who can tell more detailed, compelling, rich narratives. Whereas on the other end of that continuum, another conversational style is it's called low elaborative or repetitive. And these mothers, don't give as much new elaborative detail about experiences. They may not follow in on children's conversational leads and control the conversation a little bit more. And so those children, both when they're remembering with their family and when they're remembering independently, don't produce as elaborate and rich narratives than of children of more elaborative mothers.
Right.
Yeah.
And can memories be repressed? Because ever since Freud proposed that idea, I mean,
Right.
the psychoanalysts particularly are very prone to saying that whenever there's some, for example, a traumatic event, people unconsciously repress those memories, and then that leads to all sorts of psychological issues. But does that really happen?
So I don't think there's any area where there's more controversy, like heated controversy, in memory than that. So, I mean, so repression in a live idea. There's some research that shows that, upwards of half of a lot of professionals believe it's a thing, as you're suggesting. So psychotherapists, judges, law enforcement people believe that it's a thing. And if you also look at, well, as you're suggesting, one context that's notorious for people making claims about repressed memories is therapeutic situations, right? And there's some really interesting data that shows that, somewhere around 5% of people who have been in therapy recall something in therapy that they didn't have a previous memory of, right? So there's a lot of belief in the idea, right? And at the heart of this idea is that, what goes on is what you're suggesting, is that there's a really traumatic experience, and it's so overwhelming that we use these defense mechanisms to cope with these traumatic memories. And one of the things that we might do is unconsciously repress that memory. So push it away, push it out of conscious awareness. But yet the idea is, even though that memory is out of our awareness, it affects our behavior, and it can lead to, the idea is that it can lead to unhealthy symptoms, anxiety, nightmares, any sort of thing like that. And the idea for some folks is that one of the ways to heal from traumatic memories is to get yourself in a therapeutic situation where you can recollect those buried memories, and that's a healing sort of thing. So that's the idea, right? So your question, are repressed memories a real thing? I think, if you look at the corpus of research, there's not that much compelling evidence to suggest that that's how memory works. And I could talk about this for hours, but just briefly, things to think about are, there's not that much evidence that when we experience trauma, that we do that we push it away. Traumatic events tend to be remembered really well. So an example is, you could think of concentration camp victims, for example. It's not the case. You don't hear that those sorts of things are repressed and recovered in therapy, and there's probably, that's on the scale of really horrible, right? So, and as a memory researcher, if you think about how memory works, what I just talked about the constructive nature of memory, that completely goes against this idea of repression. So proponents of repression argue you experience something traumatic and you pack it away, and it's never changed, it's never altered, and then you recover it in sort of a pristine, perfect manner. That's just not how memory works, and there's widespread evidence that that's not the case. So I don't know. There's all sorts of, as a memory researcher, I don't, it may happen, but I don't think there's compelling evidence to suggest that it happens. On the other side of things, one interesting thing that memory researchers have done is sort of looked at some of the strategies that psychotherapists use in clinical settings to try to recover memory. So sometimes what happens, and this is based on empirical work, individuals will go into therapy and have a range of symptoms and have a psychotherapist who suggests to them something along the lines of, perhaps those symptoms you're feeling are happening to you because you've been, say, sexually abused as a child, and let's see if we can recover those memories. It's not said the way that I just said it, but that's kind of the idea. So folks use treatments that are very suggestible, so dream interpretation, imagination, age regression, those sorts of things, and patients have recovered memories in therapy using those sorts of techniques. What we also know is that if you use those sorts of techniques outside of a therapy situation and in an experimental setting, that those very techniques can create false memories of experience. And we know that from a range of studies where people have implanted false memories of, all sorts of things, from getting lost in a mall as a child, spilling punch on a bride at a wedding, to even crazy things like witnessing some sort of demonic possession. So we do know as memory researchers that under some conditions, if you use those techniques, you can create false memories that in individuals feel real and feel compelling, but are not real because they've been, implanted in an experiment.
Right. And that bit about implanting false memories, didn't that happen at, I guess we can call it a large scale in the US back in the 80s, 90s, where there was a period where there came about lots of accusations against family members that supposedly sexually abused some clinical patients, some people who were followed by therapists, psychological therapists, and basically, at least in some of those cases, those were false memories implanted or suggested by the therapist.
Yeah, I think that's the idea, and even in some of those cases that happened then and some that are happening, still happen now. Some of those recovered memories are from periods where we don't yet have autobiographical remembering. So we talked a little bit about in the beginning of this, when memories form and when we develop the ability to have representations of experience. And, there's been individuals who have recovered memories of experience, as an infant, or remember being born, or even, there's stories of having memories, in utero too. But based on everything we know about memory and how it works, there's no evidence that an individual could be recalling an actual memory. And that's not to say that you can't recall things that feel like memories, right? So things like conversations and photographs and all of that can make a memory feel real. So an individual can, have a memory maybe of a first birthday party, and they know about it because maybe something big happened. Maybe, I don't know, there was a pony at the first birthday party and parents talk about it. Siblings talk about it. There's photographs of it. There's video of it. So it feels real, but it's not a memory of experience. It's just a memory of everybody talking about it and seeing pictures, right? And that can make a memory feel real. And that could be the same sort of thing that is happening in therapy. If you're having a feeling of having recovered a memory of some very traumatic thing that happened to you when you were 3 months old or something like that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. But I would like to ask you,
Yeah.
do we know why our memories seem so fallible? Because particularly from an evolutionary perspective, wouldn't it
Yeah.
make sense for us to have evolved memories that were more reliable in a way? Because, we have to learn lots of different things to move around in the world. And, perhaps you mentioned, for example, that when it comes to traumatic events, people seem to recall them correctly.
Right.
So, I think that makes sense. But on the other hand, since it's easy, or perhaps not easy, but it's possible to implant false memories into people's minds, and there's all of these problems of memory recollection and things like that. So, am I thinking correctly or not?
No, yes, I think that's such a fun question to think about. And I think when, you're asking, I think, why do we have a memory system that is open up to all these errors? Why does our memory just exactly record reality? So I like to think about it this way. I think from an evolutionary perspective, and this is true, of any behavior or body part of any animal, is to think about what's it for, what's its function. And if you think about the function of autobiographical memory, it's probably not to develop an exact representation of experience. So if you think about the context where we use autobiographical remembering, like in everyday life, we talk about the past with others to do a whole bunch of things. We do it to build social bonds. You hang out with your friends on a Saturday and you talk about the past. And you don't need to be exact, right? And in some cases, it might be good to exaggerate a little bit or even fabricate a little bit because you might want to sound cooler than you really were or something. You might want to impress your friends a bit. And sometimes a story that's a little bit exaggerated is more compelling to listeners than the exact truth, right? So one of the things memory is for social bonding and sharing history and all of that, right? Other places where we use autobiographical memory is we use it to plan for the future. So we think of memories of the past and use those to plan for the future. We use autobiographical memories to help us regulate emotion. So we can think about situations that were similar, how we reacted, and help us regulate emotion in that sort of way. And if you think about these sort of everyday functions of memory, our memories don't need to be exactly accurate for our memory to serve those functions. And actually, under some conditions, like I described, inaccurate memory might be a little bit better. And there's all sorts of really cool studies that show there are conditions where we are inaccurate, but it's probably helpful for us. So, for instance, if we need, for some psychological reason, to have sort of a higher, better thinking about ourselves, so to inflate like our self-worth or our self-esteem, we make very systematic errors in things like alcohol consumption or voting behavior or things like that. And we do it and it's healthy. And I think if we had an unflexible memory system, we wouldn't be able to do those things. So I think it's good to think about it on a functional level like that. What's memory for? How do we use it most often in everyday life? And the other thing is sort of structural. If we had a system in our heads that exactly captured and recorded every single experience, our heads would be too big for our bodies. So it's sort of efficient to kind of rebuild memories each time rather than having them all stored there, across a life course.
Mm-hmm. And still talking about false memories,
Yeah.
are children more susceptible to someone implanting false memories into them, or does it, or is it the same for children and adults?
That's a really good question. So I think for a really long time, folks made the argument that kids were more susceptible to false memories than adults are. And I think the right answer is there's a lot of conditions under which young kids can be highly suggestible. It's relatively easy to implant a false memory in a preschool, right? It's what I do during the day. It's not that difficult to do. And it's also not that difficult to do an adult. So the conditions matter. So one example where older children and adults are more suggestible than children is situations where, say, the false suggestions build on knowledge. So, for example, there's a study that looked at children and adults' memories of a crime, a bank robbery. And in this bank robbery, there was not a gun that was used, but it was easier to suggest to adults that there was a gun because, adults have a script or an idea that, well, if there's a bank robbery, of course there's going to be a gun. So when there wasn't, but it was suggested to them that there was, they form that false memory easier than, say, a young child who doesn't have, that much knowledge about what typically would happen during a bank robbery. So you see that often in lots of studies where situations where older children or adults have more knowledge that can lead to sort of knowledge-driven errors a lot easier than younger kids because they don't have as much built-up knowledge of, of stuff and of experiences. So the answer to your question, is it easier to implant false memories in kids? The answer is it depends. So, yeah.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, of course, of course.
Yeah.
So, just one last question about false memories before we move on to the next topic.
Yeah.
So, we've talked about them mostly in a clinical context, but are there other social contexts where it's easy to implant false memories? So, for example, if people communicate rumors about someone to other people, I mean, could that work in engendering a false memory?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's one of my lines of research in my lab. We've spent a long time looking at how rumors can engender false memories in preschoolers. And so the reason that we do that, have done that, is not simply because we're interested, like, is rumor an avenue that can engender false memories, but we initially became interested in that question because we're interested in situations that can um, forensic situations that can cause false memories, right? So I'm particularly interested in the conditions, things that might lead child witnesses to be better or worse witnesses and to be able to give more accurate or less accurate accounts of experience. So in the legal system, and given the nature of the crimes that children are often called on to testify about, often there's loads of uncertainty about what happened. So if there's been, child allegations of childhood sexual abuse, or, witnessing a horrific crime, what really happened is unknown. Those are exactly the conditions under which social psychology tells us that rumors happen. If you don't know what happened, and it's also stressful and worrisome, rumors happen. So we were interested in to what extent can rumors that are spread among preschoolers, to what extent can that lead to false memories of experience? And the way that we've studied it is, not in a horrible way like that, but in a fun, ethically permissible way. So we've gone into preschool children's classrooms and done things like put on magic shows in preschool classrooms. And in some studies, we have this, super fun magic show that happens. And then at the end of the magic show, the magician reaches in his hat to pull out a live rabbit, and there's nothing there. And he apologizes to the children for failing to do the trick and leaves the building. So then what we've done in some studies is spread a false rumor that the reason that that magic trick failed is because there's a live rabbit running around loose in the classroom. And what we have done is spread this rumor to only some children in preschool classrooms. And what we find when we do that, the first time we carried out this study, it was unbelievable. And we've replicated it. Other people have done extensions. And under those conditions, nearly all children will recall seeing things in line with that false rumor. Why do they do it? Well, we learned a little bit about how and why that happens when we replicated that study and hooked up our kids to we made them wear little recorders, audio recorders around their waist, little microphones. And what we found is that if you spread a rumor to just a couple of kids under those conditions, that they all engage in conversations absolutely naturally about it, and that the rumor blows up, it gets propagated, and the very details that they're sharing with each other naturally then show up in recall, in children's recall later on. So yes, so rumors can engender false memories of experience. And, I think that I hope it has some implications for thinking about factors that can influence children's testimony in the legal system.
Yeah. And what about fantasy beliefs? What are fantasy beliefs, and can they also alter memories in any way?
Yeah, so yeah, we've studied that a little bit too, and that was a kind of legally motivated line of research too, because in a number of legal cases that were, I don't know, in the media at the time that we started studying that, there were often claims of, say, sexual abuse in group settings like daycare settings, where a lot of what the children were alleging could have happened. It'd be horrible if it did, but could have happened. But in their stories of what happened, they were often peppered with details of things that couldn't possibly have happened. So being taken away on an alien spaceship, or be taken out to sea with pirates, having to walk the plank and, swim in a sea of sharks, or, things that parents would have noticed or couldn't have happened, or things like that. So we became really interested in studying how fantasy beliefs can affect memory for everyday experiences. And one of the ways we've done that is look at children's memory for events in which, sort of culturally endorsed fantasy figures are part of that. So for instance, we've looked at children's memory for what happens when they lose their teeth. And so we found some interesting things that children who, for instance, are super strong believers in the reality of the tooth fairy, that when they recall what happened the night that they lost their tooth, they can be spot on accurate about the things that really did happen, that they put their tooth under a pillow and that they got a certain prize. But they also pepper those stories with things that couldn't have happened. Like, I saw the tooth fairy, she flew through my window and, she left me a note. That couldn't have happened. But the coolest thing that we found in that work is oftentimes those fantastic memories that parents sort of laid the ground for them. And I'll give you one of my favorite examples ever. So in this study where we asked a 5-year-old child to tell us what happened on the night that he lost his baby tooth, he told this story about how his cat ate the tooth fairy, and that, the tooth fairy would never visit again. And when we asked him about what happened, he says that he knows his cat ate the tooth fairy because he saw fairy dust on the cat's face, and that means the cat must have eaten the tooth fairy. So what we later came to find out, because in this study we were smart enough to question parents and ask them, what rituals did you engage in that night when your child lost his tooth? We found out that in this case, what happened is that not only did the parent forget to take the tooth out from under the pillow and replace it with the prize, the only thing the parent remembered to do, which the parent had done for the child's other siblings, is sprinkle glitter throughout the child's bedroom. And that was always interpreted the next morning as, oh, look, the tooth fairy was here. There must be fairy dust all over the place. So what happened is their cat got into the glitter, and the cat had glitter on his face. The tooth was still under the pillow the next morning. So this child just inferred that what must have happened is the cat ate the tooth fairy. That couldn't have happened at all. But you can see how a fantasy belief like that led to a recollection of experience that's in line with fantasy, but also sort of supported by what parents were doing. And it seems like a lot of times that's the way that fantasy beliefs work. And I also want to underline that with, in that child's narrative and other children's narratives who had a lot of fantasy stuff like that, the parts of their memory that were in line with reality were very accurate. So but one of the big findings I like to take out of that is, just because children's reports at times are sprinkled with fantasy, it doesn't mean that parts of their reports can't also be accurate. So a little bit of fantasy shouldn't render a report completely false.
Mm-hmm. But these fantasy beliefs, they also apply to adults, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a fair proportion of adults who have all sorts of fantastic beliefs about aliens as well. And yeah, absolutely. Those beliefs can engender false memories of experience. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you've already mentioned a few times autobiographical memory during our conversation, but does it have anything to do with our sense of self and the sort of person we think we are and the identity we form around ourselves? Does it have something to do with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so first of all, in order to have an autobiographical memory, one of the things you need to have is a sense of self, that you're an autonomous being separate from other people and other things. So those memories are yours, but they also, autobiographical memories are important to yourself because they essentially form your ideas about yourself. So if you think about your past experiences, what you've done, what you've chosen to do, how you've acted, how you've interacted, what your emotional responses were, what decisions that you made, all of those memories play a really important role in terms of determining your self-concept, your ideas about yourself and who you are. And there's a back and forth relationship, presumably, because as your ideas change about who you are, what's important, all of that can have, one would think, an effect that also can alter your autobiographical memories of experience. So if you're political beliefs change over time, for example, as you mature, get older, gain new experiences, presumably those new ideas about yourself might go back and change your autobiographical memories. You might think, no, there's no way at one point I held that belief. I couldn't because this is what I believe now. But there's some studies that demonstrate, there is that back and forth relationship, which is really interesting, I think.
Yeah. Do we need a narrative a narrative of our lives for us to function properly? And I mean, would that be in any way related to how we form memories?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, having a narrative, a story of our lives is, that's key to thinking about, certainly who we are. I think so. Yeah.
Hmm. Right. So let's just explore one last topic here, and in the legal realm, talking about eyewitness testimony. So, should we trust eyewitnesses, taking into account all of the things about how our memory works that we've been talking about?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say a couple of things. So the legal system is a very different context for remembering than any other context. So, we talked a little bit about what's remembering for, and we often use our memories to build social bonds, to plan for the future, to help regulate our emotions. And memory doesn't need to be exactly accurate to serve those functions. However, in a legal context, that's what memory is for. Memory needs, you need to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So there's no room for error at all. And that's a funky context for remembering, because in every other place in the world, if there's a little error, it's okay. And that's not to say that we can walk around life and every memory is completely false. We couldn't function that way at all. But in the legal context, there's not that room at all for error. And there's also a need for incredible amounts of detail, right? So in everyday life, you can have a memory for, I don't know, there was this time when I tried out for the basketball team, and I did a terrible job, and I got sad, and that motivated me to work really hard. And then I did. The next year I worked harder, and it's because of that memory of failing. I don't need to remember who was there, what I was wearing, what time of day, what the temperature was. But if something legally relevant happened, I would. So, I mean, just the whole legal context is funky for remembering. So should we trust eyewitnesses? It seems like I would want to say no, but I don't. I don't think that's the right answer either. I think we have an incredible ability, if things are salient, meaningful, traumatic, stressful, that we can give accurate testimony, about our experiences for sure. So it's certainly not the case that we can't do it. But a point that I do want to make, I think the best way to answer that question, can we trust eyewitnesses, is to look at the evolution of an allegation, right? So we know that there's all sorts of things that can influence testimony, from our own beliefs, whether or not someone is threatening us not to tell a memory accurately, how we've been interviewed, right? So there's this whole huge field that demonstrates that if individuals are interviewed in a suggestive manner, which can happen unwittingly if a forensic interviewer has a belief that something happened. So they have a belief that someone's guilty, or they have a belief that someone's a bad person. We just naturally, as forensic interviewers, would aggressively sort of pursue that one hypothesis and push questioning in a line to elicit beliefs consistent with what we believe to be true, right? So I think the most important thing to do if we're thinking about can we trust an eyewitness is looking at the evolution of allegations. Is there a reason for the person to lie, not tell the truth? Were there suggestive interviews? Were there suggestive conversations? Is there a reason for this person to not be accurate? Were they in therapy? If so, are there records? what happened. So I think that's the best answer to can we trust in eyewitnesses, just to learn as much as we can about how allegations emerged and how they changed over time. That's important as well. If there's records of allegations changing over time, that should tell us something too, and make us worry, wonder if, the memory is entirely accurate, if it's changing.
So does that mean that perhaps some eyewitness should be left out of trials because of, I mean, perhaps the kinds of relationships they have with the accused, or, I mean, anything relating to the things you just mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's important for an expert or whoever, or, for finders of fact, judges and juries, to sort of do exactly that, to gain as much information as they can about factors that can influence remembering, right? And I mean, I think I'm also assuming, we can talk about lying and memory errors, right? Like, I think what we're talking about is memory errors, that can you trust
Sure.
your memory, right? But you can also, of course, have witnesses, who lie and have reasons to do that. So there's that, and there's also sort of, it's a continuum of false memory, it happened and you're unaware, versus lying and it's deliberate. And there's also sort of something in the middle, and it's particularly relevant for young witnesses, is that, social factors can lead individuals to make claims that aren't true. So, for example, if you're a super young child, you're a 3-year-old, and you have an authority figure telling you, other children told me this happened, I think it happened to you too. Now it's your turn to tell me that happened. So you might have a child there who makes a claim. It might be false. It's not lying, right? And it's also not a deliberate, it's also not a false memory, but it's sort of an acquiescence of saying, yes, that happened because of social factors, because you have an authority figure sort of pushing you to do that sort of thing. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I understand. So, I mean, but are you implying in any way that perhaps we should be more careful about children when it comes to eyewitnesses?
No, not necessarily. There's work that demonstrates that children as young as 3 can give accurate, detailed reports of experience, even traumatic and stressful events. But they can do so usually only under, optimally non-suggestive, supportive interviewing. So I worry about everybody if they're interviewed, in a suggestive manner, or questioned in a suggestive manner. I do think, we need to particularly worry about kids, just because, there's a social difference in terms of adults as authority figures, questioning them. And, there's all sorts of social cognitive immaturity sort of going on in younger kids. But I don't want to make the claim that younger children can't be reliable eyewitnesses. If they don't have a reason to lie, and they haven't undergone suggestive interviewing, there's no reason that they wouldn't be, that they couldn't give an accurate, truthful account of their experiences.
Okay. Okay, so let's end the interview here. Just before we go, would you like to mention any places on the internet where people can find your work?
Yeah, I'm a professor at the College of Charleston, as you mentioned, and you can certainly go there and find a link to some of the work that I've done, or just contact me personally if you're interested in any of my papers. I'm always happy to share, and I'm always happy to talk memory.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Principe, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Ricardo. It was super fun. I appreciate the time.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. My channel is now more than 3 years old, and to keep it sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. If you prefer PayPal, you can also find links to it in the description box of this interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and supporters: Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Pereira Galarson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimir, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Viss, Elenian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Henrik Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windegar, Rui Nassi, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikkel Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Yugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deza Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Usmani, Charlotte Bliss, Miran B., Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, my producers, Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sérgio Codriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Nirban Balachandran. And finally, my executive producers, Michelle Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.